The Australian Financial Review.
When Australian law firm Melisons Stephen Shack merged with China's King Wood in 2012, it broke new ground.
So KWM is the first international firm headquartered in Asia. So the future for us is aligned with very much the emergence of Asia, including China.
Xi Jinping was just coming to power, and while the two countries' political and legal systems were vastly different, most lawyers, politicians and business people believed China would continue to open up to the world. One person who was there right from the start was Chinese lawyer Rupert Li. He was integral to the merger negotiations and would go on to become the firm's chief operating officer, its third most senior executive. But late last year, Rupert Li was out. His sudden departure led Financial Review journalist Max Shanahan to start digging around. And what he discovered among court files in Beijing, allegedly corrupt wind farm deals in Montenegro, and a controversial legal conference in Russia has raised serious questions about how King Wood Mallesons manages risk and conflicts across its jurisdictions.
King Wood Mallesons has no independent directors who might pull them up and say, hold on, what deals are we being exposed to? Why is Rupert, who's on our global board, borrowing 8 million Hong Kong dollars from the firm? When's he going to pay it back?
Welcome to The Fin. I'm Lisa Murray. This week, Max Shanahan on KWM's China experiment and whether it can last. It's Thursday, June 19. Hi Max, thanks for coming on the podcast.
Hey Lisa, thanks for having me.
KWM has been operating as a global law firm since 2012. What made you decide to start looking into the merged firm and how it works now?
Well, I've always been interested in how the mergers worked. It's a merge between an Australian and a Chinese law firm. They're such radically different legal systems. It must be really difficult to bridge those systems. How are they pulling it off, if they are pulling it off? And so the way this sort of all came about was I'd written a story about the global chief executive retiring, Sue Kench, and then I started to hear about this guy, Rupert Li, who was the global chief operating officer. I heard that he was leaving as well, and I'd planned to write a story about it. But then last October, one of the international legal trade publications reported that not only was he leaving the firm, King Wood Mallesons was suing him for 8 million Hong Kong dollars. And so that sort of set off all sorts of red flags.
So you started looking into Rupert Li.
Yeah, so it turned out that he got himself into quite a bit of legal and financial trouble. So obviously there was some sort of falling out, and KWM had sued Rupert Li for taking an 8 million Hong Kong dollar loan from the Hong Kong partnership. So it got to the point where we had to try and track him down. By this time, he'd left the firm. He was sort of difficult to get in touch with. So we sent someone around to his place in Hong Kong, in quite a nice neighbourhood on Hong Kong Island, and we dropped a list of questions under his door. A few days went by and I managed to track down a phone number, and I gave him a call, and he'd said he'd received our questions and he was going to send me a response.
So before we delve into Rupert Li's financial and legal problems and how he responded to your questions, let's go right back to the start. Why did Mallesons and King Wood decide to merge in the first place?
So Mallesons has always been one of the top firms in Australia. It was founded almost 200 years ago. Two of the current High Court bench did time at Mallesons. There's sort of high-profile business people and board directors like Nicola Wakefield Evans, for example. There's sort of a smattering of kind of conservative politicians that have come out of there. And so it's a place that if you go through law school and you get a clerkship at Mallesons, you're sort of set up for a good career. If you stay in the firm or through the connections you get, you can go on to a range of different careers at the bar or in business. And so the context for the merger is about 15 years ago, a lot of Mallesons rivals in Australia were doing deals to tie up with UK firms to add some sort of global element to their business. So Freehills, an Australian law firm, did a tie-up with Herbert Smith. Allen's, one of their big rivals, with Linklater's a UK firm. And Melisons had tried that a few times, but nothing really came to pass. So they started to look to China.
Chinese President Hu Jintao arrived at the White House to an elaborate welcome ceremony. The two leaders spent most of their time talking about the economy, both repeatedly uttering the word of the day.
Cooperation, cooperation.
And at this time, China's economy was really booming and it was the next big thing. Trade between Australia and China was really expanding at a rapid pace.
Well, it was because of the continuing demand from China, largely, that Australia's economy managed to fare better than most developed countries during last year's global financial crisis.
It was opening up its economy and everyone thought this growth and liberalisation would just continue as it was.
The pilot free trade zone allows foreign competitors access to China's highly protected services sector. The government is promising to cut through the red tape for businesses opening here and give investors tax benefits.
The merger was eventually done in sort of the last few months of the Hu Jintao era. And there was a new leader, Xi Jinping, who was meant to continue on this liberalisation.
However, it is widely hoped that his new government will take some drastically needed reforms in order to get the country's economy back on track and to fight the ever-growing problem of corruption.
I was actually in China at the time, in 2012, and I remember that period. I remember the merger and everyone being so excited about it. And I also remember writing stories about China at the time, opening up not just economically, but politically. Everyone expected political reforms from Xi Jinping. So there was a lot of optimism at the time.
Yeah, and both firms saw a huge opportunity in this to capitalise on that sentiment. And so the deal they ended up doing was with King Wood, which is one of the top Chinese firms. It was set up in the early 90s, just as private law firms were first allowed in China. And from the start, it wanted to really focus on doing international work and appealing to Western clients. So its name is a great example. There was no King, no Wood. They were just emulating this ideal of what an imagined kind of authoritative and well-connected Western law firm looks like. At the time they merged, they were sort of roughly the same size, between 150, 200 partners, and now the Chinese partnership is double the size of the Australian partnership. And there's this great scene in a book that was written about the history of King Wood Mallesons, where these three senior Australian partners get on a plane to Beijing and they turn up in their shirt sleeves and it's freezing cold, and they make their way to the King Wood offices in this big tall building in Beijing, and they're greeted in this huge boardroom. There's only three of them, and on the other side there's 11 Chinese partners. And this guy who was managing partner at the time, Stuart Fuller, he leans across to his colleagues and he says, I think we've undercooked this.
But despite the Mallesons delegation being completely outnumbered, the talks went well. The two firms did end up eventually merging. Tell us about the deal. How did it actually work?
So the firm's structured as a Swiss Verein, which is this sort of structure that's not uncommon in these big international law firms. And it means that each member partnership in each country is financially separate. So if things go badly in one part of the world, it doesn't bring the rest of the firm down with it. So what's different about King Wood Mallesons is there's only three main partnerships. There's Australia, China and Hong Kong. So that's a bit unique. But despite that, it's intended to present to the world as a single firm. It's pitched to clients as, I think the line they use is we're the top-tier international firm for Asia, from Asia. So the merger presented heaps of opportunities for the firm. But the different Australian and Chinese attitudes, in some cases to governance and risk, also threw up lots of challenges.
What are some of the challenges you've confronted in putting together such established firms from such different settings?
Yes. We don't have long enough for all of the challenges. It's a classic question.
In an interview about a decade ago, then global managing partner Stuart Fuller said as much.
Right from the start of King Wood and Mallesons, this concept of merger of equals, not a takeover of Australia of China or China of Australia. Everybody has an equal voice.
But he stressed that the two firms still shared these common values and the relationship was developing with speed and everything was going to plan.
I think every month and every year that goes by, people see the benefit of merging the firms.
And so while this Verein structure isolates risk, it also has the effect of clouding visibility over each of the partner firms. Particularly in the Mallesons case, when you have clients with big data protection concerns, they want to know that their data isn't going to be shared with the Chinese part of the firm. So you have to erect these walls within the firm, which sort of compound the existing walls between the partnerships. So that makes things difficult to manage in some cases. So what it really means is that while each partnership leverages the brand, the reputation, and the international connections of KWM, In practice, there's really little knowledge or transparency over what each part of the firm is working on. So I spoke to a bunch of former partners and staff at KWM, some of whom were really closely involved in the merger, some of whom were there until quite recently, and they all said that there was always an awareness that there were transparency issues in the partnership. One former partner said they called it within the firm the Great Wall of China, which he took to mean the gap between what you understand is happening and what is actually happening in the Chinese partnership. Another gave me an example. They were working with a major bank who was a client, and they had operations in Australia, Hong Kong and China, but they just couldn't find out which partner in the Chinese firm the client was using. So in the end, they had to go and ask the client directly. So there was clearly problems with communication between the international elements. And yeah, because of all these cybersecurity concerns that clients had, there were big internal boundaries erected between the partnerships. They were on completely different document sharing systems. Even simple information was difficult to obtain, and it really wasn't an environment that was conducive to any sort of cooperation or collaboration.
And Rupert Lee's job as Chief Operating Officer was to oversee that cooperation between the Australian and Chinese lawyers, but it doesn't sound like there was much going on. Max, when did Lee's problems become a problem for KWM?
Yeah, so it turns out that while he was Global Chief Operating Officer of the firm, which is quite a big job, he was also had this whole range of private business interests on the side, probably the most colourful of which is this payments company which got caught up in China's gambling crackdown in 2021. One of its employees was convicted for facilitating payments for an illegal online casino run by Sun City Group, which is quite well known in Australia for its junkets operation, which came up in inquiries into Crown and Star casinos. He was alleged to have been part of a group that helped channel funds to the chair of a listed company. The chair was also his business partner in a separate business. In 2023, he gets this huge 370 million Hong Kong dollar moneylender's claim from this mysterious small little lender in Kowloon. He says nothing to worry about there. Even if that is the case, it's sort of a unusual thing for a global law firm executive to be caught up in. And then in February last year, he gets this bankruptcy petition from a financial firm in Hong Kong. And Rupert says KWM actually helped him out here, and they even opened a file for him, helped him, he says, secure a settlement in this bankruptcy claim. King Wood Mallesons Australia completely denies that, which is a bit unusual. And the other unusual thing is that there's this just lack of agreement between Rupert and KWM about how he actually came to leave the firm. So KWM Australia says that KWM China asked him to resign halfway through last year because of, I presume, all these financial and business issues which are really piling up on top of each other. Rupert says that he actually left of his own accord and that he was retained as a business consultant at the firm until the end of last year. So there's a bit of discordance between those two explanations. Naturally, all of this made me want to look further into what he was doing while he was still working for KWM, and I discovered that in 2017 he became the director of this big state-owned electricity company that was also quite a major client to King Wood Mallesons. And about a year before Lee joined the board of that firm, it had bought into a wind farm project in Montenegro that is now the subject of corruption investigations in 3 separate countries.
Max, we're talking about King Wood Mallesons, the first ever Sino-Australian law firm, which has been operating for over a decade now. Your investigation has uncovered some real governance challenges for the firm, and these were highlighted in a wind farm deal, which its lawyers advised on in Montenegro. As you said, the deal is now the subject of corruption investigations in 3 separate countries. Tell us about the deal and how KWM was involved.
Yeah, so King Wood Mallesons provided legal advice over the course of about 3 years for this wind farm project in Montenegro. It was a product of China's Belt and Road Initiative, which was the signature foreign policy of Xi Jinping. It provided huge opportunities for legal work. So one of these projects took KWM to Malta, which is a small island in the Mediterranean. It's a European Union member country, and it sort of tried to leverage that to make its way in the world, tried to attract a lot of foreign investment through becoming a haven for offshore companies. Now, Rupert Lee had become a non-executive director of this state-owned company called Shanghai Electric Power in May 2017. He was a long-time client of King Wood Mallesons, and his appointment came in the same month that he was appointed as its global chief operating officer. So Shanghai Electric was involved in a range of deals in southern Europe, including buying a third of Malta's state-owned energy company, Malta, which was in a heap of debt at this point. And so in 2016, which is about a year before Lee joins the board, Shanghai Electric bought the rights to build this wind farm in Montenegro, which was done as a partnership with Malta. The law firm was responsible for completing due diligence on the project, but the real problem with the deal was the price that Shanghai Electric paid for the wind farm. It forked out more than 3 times the value that the wind farm had garnered just a couple of months previously. And King Wood Mallesons was the law firm responsible for drafting the contracts which enabled that deal to go through, and there's never any explanation about why that markup is paid. So Rupert Lee is not alleged to have broken any rules or to have been aware that the propriety of the deal had been called into question. He only became a director after the price markup was paid, and he told me he was unaware that KWM had even acted on the deal.
So, Max, are the investigations chiefly about that markup in price?
Yeah, so there's 3 governments investigating the deal to try and find out why. The Montenegrin, the Maltese and the Spanish governments are all in on it, and Europol's involved as well. The allegations are that the price was inflated and some of the money eventually found its way to offshore accounts held by senior Maltese politicians. And it was also controversial because of the involvement of this Maltese casino entrepreneur and property developer named Jorgen Fennick. Jorgen Fennick has been accused of orchestrating the car-bombing murder of an investigative journalist who was looking into the Missouri wind farm deal.
Caruana Galizia was the country's best-known investigative journalist. She was killed on Monday in this car, minutes after she left her home in Malta.
And another equally suspect deal involving the same characters.
Galizia ran a popular blog in which she highlighted the cases of suspected corruption in Malta. Once described as a one-woman WikiLeaks, she famously led the Panama Papers investigation into corruption in Malta.
And almost €5 million from the markup made its way to companies controlled by Fennick. So Jorgen Fennick was arrested on these charges related to the car bombing in late 2019.
Police have now arrested one of the country's most prominent businessmen in connection to the case.
Jorgen Fennick was detained by armed officers after his yacht was intercepted and searched. Malta's handling of the case has drawn international criticism.
He was released on bail in January this year, and there's still no trial date set. King Wood Mallesons isn't alleged to have broken any rules or to have been aware of the potential corruption, and a lot of it happens downstream from its involvement. But I think it is something you'd probably ask questions about. Why are we writing in this massive markup to this company no one's ever heard of? But King Wood Mallesons extends its relationship with Shanghai Electric and the Montenegro deal, continuing to act as its legal advisor, and in 2018 it secures the financing for the project to enable it to actually be constructed and go ahead.
You also came across another example that exposed the different approaches of the Australian and Chinese partnerships. How did a KWM lawyer end up as a speaker at a contentious legal conference in St. Petersburg the year after Russia invaded Ukraine?
So the senior KWM partner, Tian Wenjing, who also worked on the Montenegro wind farm deal, in May 2023, she turns up at this big St. Petersburg legal conference, which is organised by the Russian Ministry of Justice. So this wasn't just your run-of-the-mill legal conference. There were a lot of boring panels about legal professional things, but the sort of keynote speakers at this event were the Russian Foreign Minister, Sergei Lavrov, and the Russian former President, Dmitry Medvedev. There were political panels, including one which is called Russophobia, 21st Century Nazism. Most gallingly, probably, there was a panel which promoted the forced relocation of Ukrainian orphans into Russia. This is the subject of an International Criminal Court arrest warrant. That panel was headed by 2 Russian cabinet ministers, Tian Wenjing. She appeared on 2 panels.
It's my honor to talk about Chinese approach from a perspective of Chinese lawyer.
Alongside representatives of these major Russian state-owned enterprises.
I never could expect to witness such changes that we are observing currently.
One of which was the United Shipbuilding Corporation, whose representative was actually leading the panel.
I'm very optimistic about the current situation. Russia now is undergoing the period of changes.
This is the company which builds the majority of Russia's naval fleet, and it's sanctioned by the Australian government. Tian spoke about opportunities arising from other global law firms' exits from Russia and the growing market for Russian companies to arbitrate disputes in Hong Kong and China. The program for one of her panels referred to unfriendly countries such as Australia, which were continuing to strengthen their sanctions policies against Russia and Belarus. And as a result of all the Western sanctions on Russia, which has isolated it from the global financial system and enforced big Western companies to pull out of the country, that's opened up a lot of opportunities for Chinese companies. And it's natural that Chinese lawyers would follow that business. It's quite a lucrative source of business. But this kind of shows the tensions at the heart of this King Wood Mallesons relationship. On its Australian website, the firm is advising clients on how to comply with Western sanctions on Russia, including on its energy sector. On its Chinese website, Tian co-authored an article with this chief executive of a Russian energy plant company on how to actually invest in the Russian energy sector. And this guy is eventually, a couple of months later, is sanctioned.
Two very different approaches.
Yeah, and they're kind of acting at cross purposes and pulling in very different directions.
So then a final question, Max. Can KWM continue as a Sino-Australian firm, or do these different approaches to governance and risk management start to affect its brand and reputation so much that it could force a rethink on the merger?
So this whole merger was based on a bit of a punt, which is a rare thing for law firms, that China's growth was going to continue as it was, its economy and politics was going to continue to liberalise, but none of that came to pass. So the original sort of thesis for the merger isn't there anymore. But even if the Australian partnership wanted to leave the firm, there are a few things holding it back. So the Hong Kong partnership, which was the only actual combination between Australian and Chinese lawyers, has become a really profitable part of the firm. And probably the most inconvenient thing is that there's a sort of penalty clause in the merger agreement. So if the Australian partnership were to pull out, then it would have to give up the Hong Kong partnership, which is probably something it doesn't want to do. So all of this, I think, kind of shines a light on law firm governance, which probably isn't the most exciting topic. But when you consider it in light of what's happened to the big accounting and consulting firms who have the same private partnership structure, law firms have really got out of this whole post-PwC tax leaks upheaval unscathed. King Wood Mallesons has no independent directors who might pull them up and say, hold on, what deals are we being exposed to? Why is Rupert, who's on our global board, borrowing 8 million Hong Kong dollars from the firm? When's he going to pay it back? And also they don't publish accounts. There's no sort of transparency, despite being a global organisation, as they say, having almost 200 partners in Australia. They'd be bringing in hundreds of millions of dollars in revenue. But at the end of the day, it's kind of a branding issue, right? They advertise themselves as this single global law firm will connect you with Asia. We're the law firm for Asia for the Asian century. But also we have no idea what's going on in our Chinese partnership. And the firm can't even speak as one entity. I mean, when the going's good, it's King Wood Mallesons, the global law firm. But when you start to ask questions, it's we're King Wood Mallesons Australia, King Wood Mallesons Hong Kong, and King Wood Mallesons China. So I think that's something that it has to deal with.
Thanks, Max.
Thanks, Lisa.
Thank you for listening to The Fin. I'm Lisa Murray, with Financial Review reporter Maxim Shanahan joining the podcast today. The Fin is produced by Alex Gow with assistance from Mandy Coolin. Fiona Buffini is head of premium content. Our theme is by Alex Gow. If you like the show and want to hear more, follow us wherever you get your podcasts and consider rating and reviewing us as it helps others find us. For more stories about markets, business and power, subscribe to the Financial Review at afr.com/subscribe. See you next week.
The Australian Financial Review.